The people.
Live from our nation's capital, it's Deadline DC with Brad Bannon.
Welcome to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. I'm Brad Bannon because no one else would take the job. I'm a national Democratic strategist, a columnist for The Hill in Washington, D.C., and a political analyst for news radio stations KNX in Los Angeles and WGN in Chicago. My company, Bannon Communications Research, polls for progressive issue groups, labor unions, and Democrats. If you have any ideas or suggestions about Deadline DC, or if you'd like to find out more about my political polling company, you can reach me on Twitter at Brad Bannon, all one word. We have a great show for you today. In the first half hour, our guest is Kimberly Scott, the publisher of Dem Daily at DemList. She's here to discuss tomorrow's big California recall election, where Governor Gavin Newsom's political future is hanging in the balance. Then in the second half hour, on the provocative progressive political panel, our guests are Edwith Theogene, the advocacy director at Generation Progress, and our own executive producer and progressive activist, Mark Grimaldi. But before we start the show, we're going to play this clip from Vice President Harris campaigning on behalf of Governor Newsom in California.
We are here to say today we fight for Gavin Newsom. We fight for our country. We fight for the values we hold dear. We fight for working people. We fight for organized labor. We fight for dreamers. We fight for women. We fight for voting rights. And we stand as Democrats, and we are proud to do all of that and more. That's what we stand for in California. Let us send a message to the world that these are the things we stand for, these are the things we fight for, and we will not give up because we know that so much is at stake. So many are counting on us, and there is so much good that we can do. Thank you.
Okay, that was Vice President Harris campaigning in her home state of California to rally the Democratic base for Governor Gavin Newsom, who tomorrow faces a recall election. To discuss the re-election in this first half hour, our guest is Kimberly Scott, the publisher of Dem Daily at DemList. Her political column, her daily political column, is dedicated to educating and informing the public about the Democratic Party, policy, and politics. Sign up for the column is at www.demlist.com. The Twitter handle is DemList, all one word. Welcome to Deadline DC, Kim. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
Okay, first of all, it's the California recall election, which happens tomorrow, has been a long and winding road. It's had its ups, downs, and plateaus for Governor Newsom. But let's talk about the beginning. How did Newsom get into trouble in the first place, and what motivated the attempt to recall him?
Well, the recall process is very unique in California. It's only one of 19 states that allows gubernatorial recall. The difference with California and the other states is the threshold for obtaining signatures in most states is 25% of the previous gubernatorial race. In California, it's only 12%, which makes it closer to reality. But it's common fare. Every governor since 1960 has faced recall attempts. Now, historically, there's only 4 in the country that have ever actually made it to the ballot. One other, and the only successful one, was actually in 2003 in California when Gray Davis, Democrat, was successfully recalled, and Arnold Schwarzenegger was elected as the new governor. So the moment that you win an election, there's some attempt at a recall out there in California. Now, the difference here with Newsom is the pandemic. Whereas those efforts were in place, he started to take hits for handling of the pandemic, slow rollout of vaccinations. And then the true turning point, which made this more of a reality, was last November, when he was photographed without a mask on at a private party at the French Laundry, which is one of the country's most elite restaurants, while the rest of the state was on restrictions. And there's huge backlash to that. Right now, he seems to be coming out of it. The last poll I saw, which I think was Suffolk University last week, had him at 58%. No on recall, about 41% yes on recall. But that doesn't mean he's out of the woods yet.
Okay. Well, let's start with this. And by the way, the Los Angeles Times released a poll on Friday that showed no on recall had bumped up to 60%. What has Newsom's argument against the recall been? What has he been saying? You're right, he has improved his position since the summer. What has his campaign message been?
It is, as far as the opposition goes, and I should say he has right now his leading opponent, Larry Elder, is about 30% far ahead of the rest of the field. But Elder's a pro-Trumper. Everybody who is in the recall side, which there are 46 candidates, all the Republicans are fighting to see who is most like Trump. So Newsom is fighting against that line. Elder is anti-vaxxer. He is anti-mandate. He is anti-minimum wage. He is anti-choice. And Newsom's numbers on the pandemic have actually started to turn around. It may actually end up being part of what saves him. And it is the number one most important issue to the voters. But a lot depends on everything for Newsom depends on the turnout. In a race where he must get 50% no on the recall to actually survive it. But if he doesn't, and it goes to a replacement candidate, and I'll explain how it works, then that person could be elected by 30% of the vote. All they need is a plurality of vote itself.
Yeah. You mentioned the pandemic, and compared to states like Florida and Texas, Newsom has done a good job handling the pandemic. The most recent weekly figures I saw from the Center for Disease Control showed that last week the daily deaths in Florida averaged 344 daily deaths from COVID, 226 in Texas, 100 from California, which is a bigger state than either Texas or California, compared to only 31 daily deaths in New York. So one of the things that Newsom and the Democratic governors, including Gavin Newsom, are doing a much better job handling the pandemic than their counterparts in Florida and Texas by a long margin.
And I think that's what ends up saving him. Oddly, one of the things that started this, or allegedly. But another part of his strategy is how to advise people to vote. So on the ballot, there's just two questions. Do you want to recall Governor Newsom or do you not? And if you do not, then you pick a replacement candidate. Now, in 2003, when Gray Davis was successfully recalled, the Democratic Party decided that they wanted to take a risk and put a viable candidate on that replacement ballot.
Okay, Kim, we're going to have to go to break now. We're going to go to a break for our radio listeners, but we'll be staying here with our TV viewers with Kim Scott from the DemList, who's talking about the California recall. We'll be back right after these messages with more of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon.
I had not.
I want to get back to seeing my grandbabies every Sunday and smothering them with big hugs and kisses.
Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Our guest in this half hour to discuss tomorrow's California recall election is Kimberly Scott. She is the publisher, editor, and chief at DemList, which comes out of Dem Daily, which is part of the DemList empire. And you should read Kim's column. It comes out every weekday, and it's a great update on the Democratic Party, its policies and politics. Let's go back to the California recall, Kim. Tell us more about, one of the things I find very strange, because pretty much everything we talk about on the show I find very strange these days. But anyway, one of the things that's very strange is that you had a number of Republican candidates running to succeed Newsom if the recall works. There was a former Republican mayor of San Diego, that is a Republican state assemblyman. But this guy, Larry Elder, who's a right-wing talk show host, emerged from the dust. And he's really hurt himself, hasn't he? He's basically says that he opposes choice. He opposes the minimum wage. I believe he said at one point that men are smarter than women. I just don't get this. How did Larry Elder emerge from the dust and not one of these other Republicans who might have been a better alternative to Newsom?
Well, he had an audience already in the sense that he's a frequent fixture on conservative radio, and has utilized that to his advantage. He also has the support of some of Trump's close friends, Giuliani, Stephen Miller, helping advise, and he's been able to lift the platform up on all of these issues. Again, as I said earlier, the target is Trumpers. But what I'd started to say was that part of Newsom's strategy has been do not vote on the replacement candidate, where voters, regardless of whether they say yes or no on the recall, have the option of still voting on a replacement candidate. Mistake in the 2003 recall was that the Democratic Party put Cruz Bustamante, a popular lieutenant governor, on the ticket, and then he ended up, I'm thinking that even if Davis was recalled, then Bustamante would get it, but instead he came in second to Arnold Schwarzenegger. So this time, part of Newsom's strategy against Elder and the rest of them is just do not fill out that second ballot. So it's very confusing.
Okay, we're going to go back. We're going to go to back to break now, so we can bring back our radio listeners. This is Deadline DC with Brad Bannon, and our guest is Kim Scott of DemList discussing the California recall election.
History Society and The Rick Smith Show.
Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Our guest in this half hour is Kimberly Scott, the publisher and head honcho at DemList and Dem Daily, which comes out every day. You can, her Kim's Twitter handle is, what's your Twitter handle, Dem Daily?
The DemList.
It's the Dem Daily, actually, if you want to check it out. Okay. First of all, welcome back to our radio listeners. If our radio listeners would like to watch the show as well as listen to it, you can either do it at www.periscope.tv/Brad Bannon, Tiny on Facebook Live at tinyurl.com/BB Facebook Live. And you can also watch us on YouTube at tinyurl.com/Brad on YouTube. We first of all, though, we have another clip. We have Donald Trump, who was on Newsmax, claiming defeat. So let's play that clip, Mark.
Got the recall election coming up in less than a week. It's actually happening as we speak. The polls appear to show Newsom looks safer at this point. Larry Elder is the man that could take it from him. What do you think happens in California?
Well, it's probably rigged. They're sending out all ballots. It's all the ballots are, mail out, mail in ballots. In fact, I guess you even have a case where you can make your own ballot. When that happens, nobody's going to win except these Democrats. So, look, they're very good. The one thing they're good at is rigging elections. So I predict it's a rigged election. Let's see how it turns out.
That was, of course, our disgraced former president, Donald Trump, who thinks the world is in a conspiracy against him and his supporters. I guess the former president saw the polls and found out that Gavin Newsom is his prospects for survival looking better, and the former president preemptively declared defeat. What do you make of that, Kim?
This is par for the course. I mean, all he is doing is echoing, his unfounded calls of rigging an election and of cheating elections, and the same with 2020. It's their fallback on what the excuse is. And Elder's already saying the same thing.
Don't you think that's going to discourage Republicans from turning out and voting tomorrow if, Donald Trump and Larry Elder are already telling people that they've lost? Why bother and go out to vote tomorrow if you're a Republican, if the thing's rigged?
Well, I have a sound strategy.
Yeah.
But still, parties are doing everything possible to turn out. Everything rests on that. This Newsom has all the advantages. And he was originally elected in 2018 by 62%, which was the largest vote of any gubernatorial candidate since 1950. Democrats outnumber Republicans 2-1 in the state. Biden won the state by 30%. Biden is in the state or on the way to the state to campaign for him now. And it's for the first time, all the voters have actually, because of the pandemic, the voters have actually been mailed their ballots. So Newsom has the advantage, but it's all about getting out the vote. And you can be assured that both sides are doing everything possible to make that happen.
As you mentioned, there have been high-profile visits. President Biden is in California today campaigning against the recall. Bernie Sanders has been there. Elizabeth Warren has been there. We played the clip from Vice President Kamala Harris campaigning for Newsom in her home state. Have those visits made a difference in the race?
I think they definitely make a difference in the turnout. And early vote numbers are very high as well. But the bottom line is the party is not going to take any chances on this. I said it took a turn. Unfortunately, a self-inflicted one at the end of last year. But I think he's pulled it out. I think we're going to see an end result of Newsom with north of 55% in this.
Okay, well, that would be good. Now, that leads me to my next question. Let's assume that Newsom does survive the recall tomorrow. That's going to make Democrats, including me, happy, and many other Democrats. But California is a strong blue state. It's almost impossible for a Republican presidential nominee to win the state's electoral votes. So if Newsom wins tomorrow, as he appears to be on track to do, are there any lessons here for Democrats nationally, or are we just, happy to survive this mess?
Yeah, because as with any election, it's a measure of where we are in time. So that will be tied to Newsom's. Well, again, the pandemic has turned to his favor in his handling of that now in the second wave, the Delta variant. And so that reflects well on Biden as well. He should be well positioned for re-election, but as we all know, anything can happen between now and then. Even in the state, which 2-1 Dems over Republicans. But one of the things that will come out of this is I think that a change in the recall process is in addition to, this absurd half the threshold of any other state that has a process. The money is absurd. There's no campaign limits on these recall elections. There was $43.8 million spent on supporting the recall, 81.6 million opposed to the recall.
Wow.
It's absurd. Yeah. So hopefully the sum to the process. And I also think another thing is because this is the first time that all voters were actually mailed their ballot, that we'll also be seeing, I know there's legislation already underway, to make that a permanent option with California voters. And that's to Democrats.
Okay. Any final words about California before we go to break, Kim?
Good luck, Mr. Newsom.
Yeah, well...
and get out.
Yeah.
And if you want to go about background, I've written twice about it in the last 2 weeks at DemList.com.
Okay.
And Recall Reality and Recalling California.
Okay. Read Dem Daily and see what you can read it on Wednesday to find out what Kim thinks about the recall results. We're going to want to thank Kim for joining us on the show today. We're going to our halftime break here, but we'll be back with more of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. In the second half of the show, in the second half hour, we'll be discussing the political news of the week with the provocative progressive political panel. Our guests on the panel today are Edwith Theogene, Advocacy Director of Generation Progress, and our own executive producer, Mark Grimaldi. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon.
Thank you.
Hey, Dad, how do airplanes fly?
Okay.
What's in this box? Can I touch this? Where does sand come from? Is this tree good for climbing? What happens if I mix these two things together? How are babies made? What does this thing do?
Kids are curious about everything, including guns. Talking to them about gun safety in your home is a good first step, but you can do more. Always keep your guns locked, unloaded, and stored separately from ammunition. Storing your guns securely is the best way to prevent family fire, including unintentional shootings. For more information on safe gun storage and ways to keep your family safe, visit endfamilyfire.org. That's endfamilyfire.org.
What do we keep in the attic? What's this thing called? Can I ride my bike backwards?
Like I said, kids are curious. It's up to us to keep them
Hey,
safe.
Edwith, thanks
Brought
for
to you by
joining
End
us.
Family Fire, Brady, and the Ad Council.
Right now, our country feels divided,
Here we go. We
but there's a
gotcha.
place where people are coming together. I got to tell you, I was nervous to talk to someone so different than me.
Me too, but I'm glad we are.
Love Has No Labels and One Small Step are helping people with different political views, beliefs, and life experiences come together through conversation, and it feels good.
Wow, your story is so...
Interesting?
Yeah.
When people actually sit down, talk, and listen to one another, they can break down boundaries and connect as human beings. At lovehasnolabels.com/onesmallstep, you can listen to amazing, life-changing conversations and find simple tools to start a conversation of your own.
I know one thing. This conversation gives me hope.
It gives me a lot of hope, too.
Take a step toward bringing our country and your community together by having the courage to start a conversation at lovehasnolabels.com/onesmallstep. A message from StoryCorps, Love Has No Labels, and the Ad Council.
The past year proves that a lot of conventional economic wisdom is neither true nor wise. For example, we don't have the money. The power elites tell us it would be nice to do the big-ticket reforms America needs, but the money just isn't there. Then a pandemic slammed into America, and suddenly trillions of dollars gushed out of Washington for everything from subsidizing meat packers to developing vaccines, revealing that the money is there. We can't increase the federal debt. Yet, Trump and the Republican Congress didn't hesitate to shove the national debt through the roof in 2017 to let a few corporations and billionaires pocket a $1 trillion tax giveaway. So, if those drunken spenders can use federal borrowing to make the likes of Amazon and Zuckerberg richer, we can borrow funds for such productive national needs as infrastructure investment and quality education for all. The rich are the makers who contribute the most to society. This silly myth quickly melted right in front of us as soon as Senor Coronavirus arrived, making plain that the most valuable people are nurses, grocery clerks, teachers, postal employees, and millions of other mostly low-wage people. So let's capitalize on the moment to demand policies that reward these grassroots makers instead of Wall Street's billionaire takers. Tax cuts drive economic growth for all. They always claim that freeing corporations from the burden of taxes will encourage CEOs to invest in worker productivity, and voila, wages will miraculously rise. This scam has never worked for anyone but the scammers, and it's now obvious to the great majority of workers that the way to increase wages, is to increase wages. This is Jim Hightower saying, percolate up economics works, trickle down does not.
Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon, and I'm Brad Bannon. This half hour is brought to you by my political polling company, Bannon Communications Research, which polls for progressive issue groups, labor unions, and Democrats. First, we have this clip from President Biden talking about the need for vaccination.
Are calling your vaccine requirements you are threatening to challenge it.
Have at it. Have at it. Look, I am so disappointed that particularly some of the Republican governors have been so cavalier with the health of these kids. So cavalier with the health of their communities. We're playing for real here. This isn't a game. And I don't know of any scientist out there in this field that doesn't think it makes considerable sense to do the 6 things I've suggested. One of the lessons I hope our students can unlearn is that politics doesn't have to be this way. Politics doesn't have to be this way. They're growing up in an environment where they see it's like a war, like a bitter feud. If a Democrat says right, everybody says left. If a Democrat says left, they say right. I mean, it's not how we are. It's not who we are as a nation. And it's not how we beat every other crisis in our history. We got to come together. And I think the vast majority, look at the polling data, the vast majority of the American people know we have to do these things. They're hard but necessary. We're going to get them done. Thank you.
That was, of course, was President Biden talking about the urgent need for vaccination. If you'd like to know how bad things would be nationally if Donald Trump had won re-election, or if the abortive Capitol coup had been successful, all you have to do is go to Florida or Texas if you're brave enough. Florida and Texas have GOP governors Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott and Republican state legislators who failed to fight the deadly Delta variant that plagues both Sunbelt states. Florida and Texas lead the nation in a dubious category with the most COVID deaths in the week leading up to Labor Day in the whole nation. There were far more fatalities in Florida and Texas than there were in big states with Democratic governors. Last week in Florida, there were 344 daily COVID deaths. In Texas, there were 226 daily deaths compared to 100 only 100 in California and only 31 in New York, which both have Democratic governors. Adding insult to injury and death, both chief executives has threatened and bullied public educators who are trying to do everything they can to protect the health and well-being of the children in public schools. My daughter is a public school teacher, and I'm glad she lives in a state that has mandatory classroom mask requirements. Abbott and DeSantis both see their destinies leading to the White House. The dreams of parents are for their children to live long and happy lives. The hopes of mothers and fathers should take precedence over the ambitions of politics. Governors are expendable. The lives of young people are precious. You can read the rest of this column and all my columns to the Hill at muckrack.com/Brad Bannon. That's muckrack.com/Brad Bannon, all one word. Now it's time for the provocative progressive political panel. Today on the panel, we have one of my favorite guests, Edwith Theogene. Edwith is the Director of Advocacy for Generation Progress, the youth engagement arm of American Progress. In this role, Edwith works to develop and lead efforts to translate the experiences of young adults into concrete actions that advance progressive policies and increase voter turnout. Joining Edwith on the panel is our own executive producer and progressive activist, Mark Grimaldi. Mark has worked for several Democratic presidential candidates, including Joe Biden. He is also active in campaign finance reform and efforts to promote cancer research. His Twitter handle is Mark J. Grimaldi. And by the way, Edwith's Twitter handle is Who is Edwith? That's Who is Edwith, EDWITH. Welcome to the panel, both of you. Edwith, let's start from you. You know, in that clip we played, the president made a very point. I mean, first of all, the pandemic deaths are horrible. I think when he was referring to governors, criticizing unnamed governors for not aggressively fighting the pandemic, he undoubtedly was referring to Governors Ron DeSantis in Florida and Governor Greg Abbott in California, where, there have been hundreds of COVID just in the last week. And it drives me crazy. It just seems to me, besides the horror of COVID and the Delta variant, the other troubling thing about this is how Americans can't unite in a common purpose to fight this deadly pandemic. I've seen polls where, all sorts of people who identify themselves as Republicans don't want mask mandates. They don't want to get vaccinated. And meanwhile, people are dying. And it's very troubling to me that there's no sort of common purpose here to, unite against a foe, the pandemic, and fight this thing. And it seems to me it says something very troubling about the nature of this country. Edwith, what do you think?
I agree in some aspects. I think what has been happening a lot, especially in social media, there seems to be tons of misinformation, tons of people on either side trying to debunk the other. And I think you're right. Instead of the tension point or the aspect to address is like, how do we protect ourselves against COVID? How do we navigate? I think all of us are scared and worried for the safety of our families, for our own personal health and stuff. So instead of us trying to address that, it seems like one side is just trying to one up the other. And I don't know if it's as simple to draw the line of being like Democrat versus Republican, but there's definitely like vaccine versus like pro-vaccine, and so much misinformation that's out there. So that is really troubling. And as someone from Florida, born and raised, and it's like back to school season. I know you shared a couple of like news clippings, but I woke up this morning to specifically see that COVID deaths has more than doubled for Florida kids as they return to the classroom. And that's really sad. Like, I'm not a parent, but I have, I went through my Facebook and I love like the first day of back to school to see all my friends like share pictures of their children, going back to school. And it's sad that like, as someone from Florida, seeing that my peers are sending their kids back to school within these conditions, it's a sign of the times. And I wish that there was more unity for us to protect the most vulnerable in our communities. And figure out what that looks like. Like, I know there's a variety of different reasons why people choose to get vaccinated and why people don't. And, I know we'll get into this about like the nuances of like personal choice and like autonomy. But I do think this is a chance for us to unite and figure out how do we keep each other safe? How do we move forward as a country, instead of tearing each other down? So I do find that troubling too.
Mark, do you think last week President Biden called for people to get vaccinated? He mandated that federal employees and employees of contractors who do work for the federal government, they are now required to get vaccinated. Do you think President Biden's efforts are going to have any effect, or are there people, the hardcore anti-vaxxers, just going to, keep spreading the disease?
I think both. I think you're going to see the numbers move because, unfortunately, some people, unless you put rules in place and requirements, just won't act, even if it's in the best interests of not only themselves, but their community. With the rule that private employers of more than 100 employees will have to require either vaccination or weekly testing due to the OSHA rule. We'll see there'll be legal challenges to it, but that's going to be a huge difference, I believe. And the polling is on his side, which I know we're coming up on a break, but I can talk to you more about that when we get back if you want, Brad.
Okay, we're going to a break now for our radio listeners. We'll hang in there for our video viewers. We'll be back with more of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon and the Provocative Progressive Political Panel right after this break.
What I know about courage, I learned from my adoptive mom. She said sometimes.
Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. We are in the middle of the Provocative Progressive Political Panel. Joining us on the panel today are Edwith Theogene, Advocacy Director at Generation Progress, and our own executive producer and progressive activist, Mark Grimaldi. In this segment, I want to discuss the restrictions on choice in Texas. About, I guess, on September 1st, the Texas, a law proposal passed by the Texas legislature became law, which virtually bans all abortions in Texas, which I never thought to see we would be in that situation. But basically, for all intents and purposes, it bans all abortions in Texas. A group of pro-choice advocates asked the U.S. Supreme Court to stay the new law going into effect. The Supreme Court decided to let the law stand. And so people, and especially women in Texas, are facing a horrible situation. Edwith, I'm very troubled by this because the Supreme Court let the Texas law stand, and during its fall session, which we are fast approaching, I assume it will rule on the Texas law again. We'll also consider a Mississippi ban on abortions, which I believe takes effect 15 months and 15 weeks into a woman's pregnancy. I'm feeling very bad about this because it may very well be a 5-4 majority in the Supreme Court that will overturn Roe versus Wade. And I fear what will happen is they may find a way to avoid the Texas law, but as sort of a compromise, they will let the Mississippi law stand as sort of a compromise, which has a 15-week limit. What's your take on this, Edwith?
I mean, I don't know what other way to say this except this is bananas. As someone who worked in the reproductive rights space, and this is not a joke, like I know I'm like laughing and stuff like that, but this is very, very serious. As someone who's worked in the reproductive rights space, fighting all different kinds of, anti-abortion bills and legislation, this is unique and horrifying in a lot of different ways, because not only does the Texas ban prevent someone from having an abortion past 6 weeks, where 85% of people who obtain abortion do so like at least 6 weeks into their pregnancy. So they don't even know that most people who are pregnant around 6 weeks don't even know that they're pregnant. So that's one aspect. The second aspect of this bill that's really horrifying is that it encourages...
Edwith, I'm going to have to cut you off there. We're going to a short break to bring back our radio listeners. We'll be back with more of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon right after this break.
Fighting for healthcare reform around the country. Until next time, stay healthy.
Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. We're in the midst of the Vocative Progressive Political Panel. Our guest on the panel today, our executive producer, Mark Grimaldi, and the advocacy director at Generation Progress, Edwith Theogene. Edwith, you were talking about the Texas ban. What do you think will happen if the Supreme Court basically dumps Roe versus Wade and accepts very stringent state laws that basically wipe out choice?
I mean, Roe versus Wade was always the floor, not the ceiling of what access to abortion really is. And Roe versus Wade basically allowed for states and for people who are anti-abortion, anti-choice to step in and make it more difficult and challenging for people to practice their reproductive autonomy and access abortion care, which is essential health care. So we need a better solution to this. We need actual federal legislation that protects access to abortion, one of which is the Women's Health Protection Act. We know that Nancy Pelosi responded to the Texas bill by saying that she's going to call a vote in the House for the Women's Health Protection Act. So we need to call Congress to make sure that this bill can become law. It needs to pass the House. It needs to move on and pass the Senate. Like, we need access to abortion to be protected because the court is not even following precedent at this point. And like you said, we don't know what's going to happen this fall around the Mississippi case. And now I believe there's 8 states who are saying that they are excited to see what has happened in Texas, and they're going to be introducing their version of the Texas abortion ban in their states, Florida being one of them. And I also want us to just remember this one nuance. In the same time that Texas, this abortion ban was allowed to be enacted, we also saw a voter suppression bill pass in Texas as well. So like you have self-determination being chipped away at every aspect within a state like Texas. And I want us to think about what is that going to look like across this country. This is not just something that's happening to Texas. This is, I think it implicates the rest of the country as well. And one last thing, I know this is a lot, but the most egregious thing about the Texas ban is that it supports vigilantes. It supports people to go out there. If you are found to have an abortion, someone can report you for either receiving an abortion, supporting someone getting an abortion, performing an abortion on someone, and receive $10,000 from the state for participating in that. That is wild to me, that in this moment they're encouraging that kind of community behavior, and that is a very concerning trend. I feel like it's in alignment with the January 6th insurrection that we saw happen. It's anti-democratic. Like, I can just go on about this. So this is just what I don't know.
It's very bleak. Mark, let's change subjects. Today there was an article in the Wall Street Journal which reported a Democratic House proposal to pay for the president's Build Back Better program, which would cost about $3.5 trillion over 10 years. According to the Wall Street Journal, and this must have sent shivers through their listeners, the Democratic House plan would increase the corporate tax from 21% to 26.5%. It would impose a 3% surcharge on top earners and raise the capital gains tax. People must have been horrified this morning when they picked up their Wall Street Journal. Mark, it seems to me, I think what people forget is, especially in terms of raising the corporate income tax, that's just reversing something that the Republicans did with Trump's help a few years ago when they lowered the corporate income tax. Now, despite the fact that this program, which is urgent and necessary for America's economic and environmental future, is going to be funded on the backs of corporate America and very wealthy Americans, there's already, a hue and cry from Republicans against this proposal. What's your take on it, Mark?
Well, as so many other things have ended up pointing toward, it's going to, whether or not it can pass, it's going to come down to 2 senators, Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, unfortunately. And I know I sound like a broken record saying that, but that's just what we're dealing with,
any number of important pieces of legislation.
Exactly.
Abortion would be one. Joe Manchin describes himself as pro-life, which means at least one Democrat will vote against the Pelosi-inspired bill that Edwith mentioned a few minutes ago.
It's really frustrating because we saw, what happened when Republicans were in power. Speaking of taxes, as you brought up, Brad, they had the Trump tax bill, which gave unprecedented tax breaks to the wealthiest Americans. So, these changes in a lot of ways are simply rolling those back. But of course, the Republican talking point is your taxes are going to be raised, when in reality, it's being talked about simply rolling back the Trump tax cuts in a lot of ways, which Republicans and corporations, I have news for you, did damn good with those tax rates and didn't seem to have any problems whatsoever. So I think they'll be just fine if these changes are made, regardless of, what their talking points are. And I want to go back to one thing you talked about earlier, Brad, because it really struck a chord with me, if you don't mind, regarding the vaccine mandates. one thing, first of all, there's a huge amount of support in the Associated Press in August found that 55% of Americans are in favor of requiring government workers to be fully vaccinated, compared with only 21% opposed. And there's similar majorities who backed vaccine mandates for healthcare workers, teachers. But I was reading a post last night, and as I mentioned before, I have 2 young daughters who are 4 and 6, and they can't get vaccinated right now because the vaccine is not available for children under 12 years old. So we've had to make the difficult decision of sending our older daughter to school, but keeping our younger daughter out of school. And she doesn't see any friends. She doesn't see anyone her age. She sees her sister, her mom, and her dad, and that's it. And that's her life until she can get vaccinated. And you have all these other people who can get vaccinated and not only protect themselves, but protect their little ones. Not only do they refuse to protect them, but they also are putting in danger others around them. So this a very viral post on Twitter that has gone viral in the last 2 days is from a woman who has a 9-year-old and a 13-year-old who both are a month clear of COVID. Her 9-year-old is still getting regular headaches. Her 13-year-old can't smell or taste food. And these are the children who survive and who don't die. There's heart problems, permanent heart damage, lung damage. And these long COVID cases, people don't know what the future is going to hold for the rest of their children's lives. And that's just the children. So when President Biden was talking about these Republican governors playing games with people's lives, a child is completely innocent. They can't make these decisions for themselves. They rely completely on the adults who are their parents and their guardians and their teachers and their elected officials. So if they are going to be at the point of their health being neglected in places like Florida and Texas, that literally could kill them, or at least permanently damage them for the rest of their lives. So that's what's at stake when this conversation happens. And I just think we've been talking about it so long that I think sometimes that type of detail and that type of specific situation and danger gets lost on people. So I just wanted to share that. So thank you for letting me do so.
And I wanted to add to that too, that we look at people who say that they're pro-life, but yet they're constantly putting other people's lives at risk. And it makes me wonder, what does that really even mean to you, right? Let's look at, again, Texas, a place that wants to fight against the vaccination mandate. They want to fight against mask wearing, but they want to protect the life of what they consider to be the unborn, which also puts the lives of living at risk sometimes. So it's really kind of fascinating to me. And then the other, with the 10,000, people are hungry. People need economic support. So you're encouraging them to basically interrupt other people's lives and rights so that they can get an additional $10,000. It is just wild. And I feel for you, Mark. I really do. When I saw the article about Florida, I just can't imagine being a parent in these times and sending your child to school and not being able to have, to keep them safe. And that's just very hard.
It's tough.
Yeah, it's a very difficult situation. And, a lot of people, my daughter was telling me she's a high school teacher, public high school in an inner city, which means most of her students take mass transit to get to school. And, she said it's really hard, everybody wearing their mask, but you got to do it because you got to protect the children. I mean, they're our future. Anyway, that's it for Deadline DC with Brad Bannon today. I want to thank our guests, Kimberly Scott, Edwith Theogene from Generation Progress, and our own Mark Grimaldi. Leslie will be back tomorrow. I think I'm going to be on the show with Leslie. Watch Deadline DC next Monday, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, or the podcast anytime on Periscope TV at periscope.tv/Brad Bannon.